On February 28, 1944, at an airfield in Debden, England, a group of young men stood in the pre-dawn freezing cold, staring at a line of aircraft they had never touched before. These were the legendary P-51D Mustangs, fresh from the factory, the paint still tacky to the touch. Most of these pilots had hundreds of combat hours in other planes, but for this specific machine, they had zero training, no ground school, no practice flights, not even a single takeoff. Standing before them was Lieutenant Colonel Don Blakeslee, a 26-year-old with a reputation for being as cold as the winter air. He had just made a promise to the high command that seemed like a suicide pact. He told his generals that these men would be combat ready in these new, complex fighters within 24 hours. When asked how they could possibly master a high-performance aircraft they'd never flown in a single day, Blakeslee's response was a chilling piece of tactical insanity. "We'll learn how to fly them on the way to the target." But the target wasn't a training range or a local patrol. It was Berlin. 4 days after climbing into these cockpits for the first time, these same pilots would be tasked with the longest single-engine fighter mission in history and 1,100-mile round trip into the heart of the German capital. This wasn't just a test of a new airplane. It was the moment the strategic air war shifted from a defensive struggle for survival into a relentless hunt that would eventually break the back of the Luftwaffe. To understand how one man could bet the lives of his entire group on a calculated risk this extreme, you have to understand that the Mustang, the plane we now call the Cadillac of the skies, was originally considered a failure at high altitude. When the North American P-51 first took to the air in 1940, it was powered by an Allison engine that made it a beast at low levels, but a complete disappointment above 20,000 feet. It was fast, yes, but it couldn't breathe in the thin air where the B-17 bombers fought. While the British loved it for reconnaissance, the Americans initially ignored it as a high-altitude escort. But the British had a revolutionary idea. What if they took this American airframe and married it to the heart of a Spitfire? They dropped in a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, and the transformation was nothing short of a miracle. Suddenly, the Mustang didn't just fly, it climbed like a rocket, reaching speeds of 440 miles per hour at nearly 30,000 feet. This was the birth of the machine that could finally go the distance. Yet, in a move of typical bureaucratic oversight, the Pentagon originally classified the Merlin-powered Mustang as a tactical ground attack fighter simply because its predecessor had been won. While the 8th Air Force was bleeding out over Germany because their bombers had no protection, the best escort fighter in the world was being diverted to tactical units for low-level strafing. It took a man like Don Blakeslee, who had been fighting the Germans since 1941, long before the United States even entered the war, to realize that policy was standing in the way of victory. Blakeslee wasn't just a pilot. He was a volunteer who had crossed the border to join the Royal Canadian Air Force just to get into the cockpit of a Spitfire. By the time he transferred to the American forces, he understood aerial combat with a precision that bordered on the superhuman. He had flown the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, rugged machine that he famously described as flying a bathtub compared to the grace of a Spitfire. He knew that to win, he needed the agility of the British fighters, combined with the range to reach Berlin. When Blakeslee finally got his hands on a P-51B in December 1943, he knew instantly that the war had changed. The Mustang had 401 gallons of fuel capacity, with its drop tanks giving it 7 hours of endurance. No other fighter on the planet, not the Thunderbolt, not the Lightning, and certainly not the short-ranged Spitfire, could stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. Blakeslee returned to his command at the 4th Fighter Group with a singular, obsessive mission: get his men into Mustangs and get them into the fight immediately. The official military transition period for a new aircraft was weeks, if not months. Blakeslee did it in a morning. He realized his pilots were already masters of the sky. They didn't need a classroom. They needed a mission. On March 4th, 1944, that mission arrived. For the first time, single-engine fighters appeared over the rooftops of Berlin. The psychological blow to the German defenders was devastating. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, reportedly remarked that the moment he saw Mustangs over the capital, he knew the war was lost. But Blakeslee's brilliance wasn't just in reaching the target, it was in how he changed the rules of engagement once they got there. Before Blakeslee and General Jimmy Doolittle took charge, fighter escorts were ordered to stay glued to the bombers at all costs, acting as a passive shield. Blakeslee hated this. He believed aggressiveness was the only path to victory. He didn't want to wait for the Germans to attack the bombers. He wanted to hunt them down in the clouds, on the airfields, and in their own backyard. Blakeslee developed a tactical maneuver that left his own pilots in awe. Instead of diving into the chaotic dogfights below, he would position his Mustang high above the battle, circling like a hawk. He would monitor multiple radio frequencies at once, orchestrating a three-dimensional chess game at 300 miles per hour. He would vector his squadrons toward developing threats, coordinating attacks with a level of situational awareness that seemed impossible before the age of radar and computers. He told his men, "I'm going to fly the tail off each one of you. Those who keep up with me, good. Those who don't, I don't want them." He never asked for a victory marking on his own plane. He never named his aircraft. He simply wanted to destroy the enemy. By April 1944, just 2 months after receiving the Mustangs, Blakeslee's 4th Fighter Group had obliterated the 500 victory mark. One of his squadrons claimed 26 kills in a single day, a record that remains one of the greatest feats in American military history. The Luftwaffe was losing its best pilots faster than they could be replaced. While the Germans could still build planes, they couldn't build experience. They were running out of fuel and running out of time. Blakeslee's relentless pressure turned the German sky into a meat grinder. His aggression was so absolute that he led 65 Mustangs on a 1,270-mile shuttle mission all the way to Soviet territory in Russia, proving that there was no corner of Europe where the Luftwaffe was safe. Don Blakeslee flew more combat missions and more operational hours than any other American fighter pilot of World War II. He was wounded 9 times and earned 9 Purple Hearts, yet he refused to discuss his accomplishments after the war. He didn't want the fame. He felt he had simply done his duty. When he finally left the 4th Fighter Group in late 1944, he had overseen the transformation of the air war. The casualty rates for bomber crews, which had once been a staggering 77%, plummeted. Men who once felt they were flying into a death sentence suddenly had a 74% chance of surviving their tour. The difference was the Mustang, but more importantly, the difference was the man who refused to wait for permission to use it. By D-Day, the Luftwaffe had been so thoroughly broken in the skies over Germany that they could only muster a handful of sorties against the invasion beaches. The greatest amphibious operation in history was protected by an invisible wall of air superiority built months earlier by Blakeslee's pilots. When we look back at the P-51 Mustang, we see a beautiful machine, but we must remember that an aircraft is only as effective as the will of the person flying it. Don Blakeslee didn't just give his pilots a better plane. He gave them a philosophy of total, uncompromising aggression. He proved that strategic victory isn't found in the safety of the bombers, but in the relentless pursuit of the enemy. He took the fight to Germany's doorstep, and he never once looked back.